When you picture medieval Europe, you might imagine castles, knights, or cathedrals. But that's the high-level view. Go lower down in the dirt, past the nobility and into the mud homes, and you'll find where most people lived, the peasant class. And for them, winter wasn't a season, it was a siege. The cold didn't gently settle on the land. It slammed into it like a brick wall, unforgiving, unrelenting, and often fatal. There were no thermostats, no thick coats from Amazon, no backup generators, just straw beds, firewood that ran out too fast, and prayer. Lots of prayer. This book isn't about medieval glory. It's about medieval grit. How the people who had the least managed to survive the worst. The ones with no servants, no land of their own, and barely enough to eat on good days, how they made it through the dark, freezing, 6-month stretch of winter with little more than mud, ashes, and stubbornness. You'll learn how entire families, huddled together in single-room huts, wrapped in the same clothes they'd been wearing for months. How livestock weren't just a food source, they were a source of heat. How straw wasn't just bedding, it was insulation. And how hunger in winter wasn't an inconvenience, it was a slow, creeping death that knocked on every door. But you'll also learn how they fought back, not just with fire, but with rituals, superstitions, and community. How villagers worked together to share warmth, food, and protection. How holidays like Yule and Candlemas weren't just for celebration. They were psychological fuel to survive the worst days of the year. We'll strip away the romanticism and reveal the real techniques medieval peasants used to fight frostbite, starvation, wolves, and sickness, all without modern knowledge or supplies. This isn't about fantasy, it's about facts. And the reality is this: if you were dropped into a medieval winter as a commoner, you probably wouldn't make it through the first week. But they did, over and over again. This is their story told night by night, frost by frost, fire by fire. Don't forget. Snow-covered cottages and cozy hearths. The medieval winter wasn't picturesque. It was a living hell made of mud, smoke, and bone-cracking cold. If you were a peasant, someone without land, money, or status, surviving winter wasn't about comfort. It was about enduring constant, unrelenting discomfort for months on end. You didn't live through winter, you fought through it. And most of the time, you lost something: your health, your livestock, your food, or someone you loved. So what did winter actually feel like in the medieval world? Let's go inside. The house was cold, always. Your home was a single-room hut made of wattle and daub, a frame of sticks packed with mud and dung. Maybe some straw, maybe not. If you were lucky, the walls kept out the wind. But they didn't keep out the cold. There were no windows, just tiny slits or shutters you stuffed with rags. The roof thatched. It leaked constantly and trapped every kind of smell: manure, smoke, mold. When snow piled on top, it pushed the straw down, sometimes causing it to collapse. People died under their own roofs. The cold lived inside with you. You didn't go inside to warm up. You were already inside, and it was still freezing. The floor was the earth itself, no floorboards, no rugs, just dirt, packed mud, cold, wet, Uneven earth that turned into sludge when it rained or snow melted. And it was alive rats, fleas, worms, lice. You didn't just sleep on it, you slept with it. You might lay straw or hay down, maybe a few planks if you were lucky, but the chill rose through it like a curse. Children crawled in it. You cooked over it. You coughed over it. That dirt was your world. And it was always damp, always cold, always dangerous. You couldn't escape the smicado fight the cold. You needed a fire every day, all day. But most peasant homes had no chimney, just a hole in the roof or no hole at all. So when you lit a fire, the smoke stayed with you. It stung your eyes. It coated the walls in soot. It filled your lungs. Babies and elders coughed constantly. Respiratory infections were common. You'd wipe your face and your fingers would come back black. Still, it was better than freezing. The fire had to stay lit. You didn't let the fire go out, ever. If it did, you were in trouble. You might not have dry wood. You might not be able to start it again. Matches didn't exist. Flint and steel required skill and dry kindling. So you tended your coals. You buried them in ash to keep them alive overnight. Losing the fire wasn't just annoying. It was dangerous. It could mean frostbite by morning or worse. Clothes were never clean and never changed. You wore the same wool tunic, leggings, and underlayer day and night. For weeks, maybe months, there was no rotation, no closet, no seasonal wardrobe. You lived in your clothes. You slept in them. You bled, sweated, urinated, and shivered in them. Laundry, a rare event, and not in winter. You didn't want wet clothes in freezing temperatures, so the smell built up. So did lice. You'd scrape your skin bloody from scratching and still not get relief. Some peasants sewed bits of sheepskin inside their garments for warmth. Others stuffed grass or moss inside their shoes. It helped. Barely. The wind was a constant threat. A good storm could rip the roof right off. Wind howled through cracks in the walls and floor. At night, it shrieked like a ghost and made sleep impossible. You stuffed rags into holes. You pressed your back against the wall to block it. Still, it came. Under doors, through the thatch, around your ankles, into your lungs. The wind was a constant, invisible enemy. You slept close to everyone and everything to stay warm. Your entire family slept in the same bed, sometimes with the livestock. Chickens under the blanket, dogs curled near your feet. Maybe a pig or a goat if you could fit one. Not because you liked them, but because their body heat kept you alive. You spooned your siblings. You held your child against your chest. You wrapped arms and legs into a tangled, shivering mass. It wasn't comfort. It was necessity. Night meant real fur. There were no street lamps, no glow from the city. When the sun went down, the world turned black, and in that darkness came fear. Wolves howling from the forest. Bandits who knew the cold made people careless. The wind screaming through empty fields. Superstition, spirits, witches, demons walking under moonlight. People feared the night because it brought things that couldn't be explained and couldn't be fought. So you locked the door if you had one, huddled around the last embers, and prayed you'd wake. Up. You were always sick. Your nose ran. Your throat ached. Your chest rattled with every cough. There were no antibiotics, no cough syrup, no Tylenol. You drank broth. You chewed bark. You prayed. Children died in their sleep. So did elders. A cold could become pneumonia. A fever could become fatal. You didn't know why, you just knew you had to keep breathing. Food was scarce and monotonous in midwinter. The root cellar was half empty. You ate gruel, cabbage, onions, maybe some dried beans or oats, meat, rare, milk. Maybe, if your goat survived. Every meal was a gamble. Was the food too old? Was it moldy? Would it make you sick? But you ate anyway. You had to. You aged fast. Cold wears you down. Year after year, it cracks your joints and stiffens your back. Your hands swell from frostbite. Your teeth rot from malnutrition. Your skin cracks and bleeds. By 30, you felt like 60. By 40, you were probably dead. And still, you kept moving. Because if you didn't, your family wouldn't eat. The cold wasn't a season, it was an opponent. In the medieval world, winter wasn't a backdrop. It was a trial. And peasants didn't get to opt out. They didn't flee to warmer lands. They didn't take a vacation. They survived the coldest nights with whatever they had: mud, fire, animals, and sheer will. And even then, not all of them made it. So, when you picture a snowy night in the Middle Ages, don't think of candles glowing in a cozy room. Think of coughing in the dark, of rats scratching the floor, of a fire that might go out, and a scream in the woods that might not be the wind. That was the real winter, and surviving it was just the beginning. When the temperature dropped in medieval Europe, peasants didn't reach for blankets because most didn't have any. There were no fluffy duvets, no thick wool comforters, and no piles of linens waiting in a chest. If you were cold, you didn't bundle up. You bundled together with straw, animals, and whatever body heat you could hoard. In the Middle Ages, warmth was something you fought for with instinct, not luxury, and every night. The battlefield was your own bed. Cloth was currency, not comfortlets. Get this straight, fabric was expensive. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, it all took time and labor. And peasants didn't have spare time or spare anything. Wool had to be sheared from sheep, cleaned, spun, and woven. Linen came from flax. Cotton, basically non-existent in Europe. If a peasant had a blanket, it was a coarse, scratchy woolen sheet passed down through generations, patched, stained, and often too small. Many slept without one. Others wrapped themselves in their only outer garment, a cloak. Children might share a single covering. Infants were swaddled tight in cloth scraps. The idea of a warm, individual blanket was laughable. So what did they use? When cloth ran out or never existed, peasants improvised. Straw. Dry straw wasn't just bedding. It was insulation. Families stuffed it under and over themselves. It itched. It poked. It attracted lice. But it held heat. Moss or leaves, collected and dried. Less effective than straw, but better than nothing. Animal skins, not fur coats. Rough, cured hides from goats, pigs, deer. Not elegant, just survival. Old cloaks or tunics, pea-soaked from toddlers, blood-stained from chores, reused again and again. You didn't ask what was on you. You asked if it was warm. And it didn't come all at once. Peasant families didn't tuck themselves into individual beds with clean sheets and soft pillows. They layered together on rough bedding like stacked firewood, surrounded by livestock, dirt, and the bitter chill of uninsulated walls. But even worse, they didn't all sleep at the same time. In the Middle Ages, many peasant households practiced sleeping in shifts, not for luxury, not for privacy, but for one reason only: survival. This video explores the overlooked strategies medieval families used just to make it through the night, how they slept, who stayed awake, and why rest wasn't just rare, it was tactical. One room, one bed, one objective. Stay alive. Most peasant homes were one room, no bedrooms, no privacy, one fire, one door, one bed if you were lucky, and that bed was usually a wooden frame or just straw laid across the dirt. Everyone slept in the same space. Parents, children, sometimes elders, and even animals. If the fire was dying, someone had to get up and fix it. If wolves or thieves were lurking, someone had to listen. That's where sleep rotation came in. Why sleep in shifts? Tending the fire. The fire was life. Let it go out, and the family risked freezing. Someone had to stay semi-awake to feed it, guarding the home. In certain areas, especially on borderlands or during conflict, peasants had to watch for raiders, thieves, or predators. Caring for the sick. Winter brought disease. If someone had fever or coughing fits, another had to stay up and tend to them, rotating warmth. In some families, sleepers swapped places through the night. Those on the edge, where the cold hit hardest, moved into the middle and vice versa. Sleep wasn't peaceful, it was strategic. First sleep and second sleep. A real thing. Medieval people often slept into distinct chunks. It wasn't continuous. Here's how it worked. First sleep, from sunset to around midnight. Waking period, 1 to 2 hours of quiet wakefulness, tending fire, praying, even light chores. Second sleep, from early morning hours to dawn. This pattern was normal. It wasn't insomnia, it was cultural. And in peasant homes, it was often required. This break allowed for duties, shifting positions, or simply surviving the long winter dark. How families organized the bed in a cold peasant home. Bed wasn't about space, it was about heat hierarchy. Parents in the middle, not just for dominance, but because they were the strongest heat sources. Children on the inside edges, protected by parents' bodies from the cold. Elders and teens on the outside, tougher, more likely to wake and tend fire. Infants swaddled tightly, often held all night for warmth. Some families literally rotated spots every few hours. Others had a designated fire watcher who stayed lightly awake while others slept. You didn't toss and turn. You didn't stretch out. You curled into a ball, covered your mouth with cloth, and tried to ignore the cough next to you. Noisy nights were normal with 10 bodies in one room. Sleep was chaotic. Babies cried. People S&O red dot. Someone always coughed. Someone always needed to pee into a clay pot, into the corner, or outside if they could stand it. The fire popped. The wind howled. A chicken might flap and scream in its sleep. And if a thief crept in, or if wolves were circling your livestock pen, everyone jumped up at once. There was no such thing as deep sleep, not for peasants. The bed itself wasn't comfortable, let's not romanticize it. The bed was usually a platform of rough wood, a sack stuffed with straw or dried grass, maybe a thin mattress shared, covered in coarse, flea-ridden cloth. It stank. It crawled. It creaked. It absorbed everything: sweat, sickness, rot. If a child had an accident, that spot stayed wet for weeks. Pillows, if you had one, it was made from hay. Sheets, not a chance. Clean anything, not likely in winter. Who stayed awake, and Wyatt family had its own system. Sometimes fathers took first watch, keeping the fire alive and standing guard. Mothers woke later, fed babies, or checked the stew pot. Older children were trained to half sleep, able to jump up when needed. It was rarely official, but everyone knew when it was their turn to listen for wolves, feed the fire, or comfort a coughing sibling. You didn't sleep unless someone else was ready to wake up. When someone got sick, illness ruined any hope of rest. Fevers needed cloths, teas, and someone to check their breathing. Vomit or diarrhea meant constant mess. Cold could kill in the middle of the night. Someone always watched the baby, the elder, or the weak. Families didn't have doctors. They had the night, and they faced it like soldiers, silent, alert, exhausted. Why peasants didn't complain about sleep? Because they couldn't. Fatigue was normal. So was back pain, swollen joints, and red eyes. But complaining, that didn't feed the kids. That didn't chop wood. That didn't help plant fields. So they slept in short, cold bursts, woke up stiff, and got on with their day. There was no choice, only rhythm. Even religion didn't promise rest. Monasteries rang bells before sunrise. Some lords expected labor at dawn. Church feast days might mean less work, but never more sleep. Prayer happened in the middle of the night, too. Some devout peasants used the waking period between first and second sleep to beg God for warmth, food, or survival. Sleep wasn't sacred, survival was. Sleep wasn't rest. It was rationed survival in medieval peasant homes. Sleep wasn't about comfort. It was a survival strategy, timed, rotated, and interrupted to keep the family alive. Fire had to burn, cold had to be fought, danger had to be heard. Someone always had to be half awake. So when the night fell heavy and the wind screamed through the thatch, sleep came in shifts, not as peace, but as a pause between the next task. And if you slept too deep, you didn't wake up. In the modern world, we take clothing changes for granted. You wake up, get dressed, go out, come home, change again. You've got clean drawers, weather options, seasonal storage, fast fashion, maybe even style. Now erase all of that. In the medieval world, especially for peasants, clothes were not something you changed. They were something you lived in, slept in, worked in, bled in, gave birth in, died in. This chapter strips down the hard truth of medieval peasant clothing and why, during the coldest nights, those layers never left your skin. Clothes were rare, expensive, and often home-made fuel. were a medieval peasant. You likely owned one tunic, one pair of woolen hose leggings, one undertunic or shift if you were lucky, one cloak or mantle, one pair of shoes maybe, and maybe a head covering coif, hood, or wimple. That's it. No closet full of options. No backup pair of pants. Every item was stitched by hand, often by you or someone in your village. Cloth was currency. Wool took time. Linen was labor-intensive. Dyeing, expensive. Washing, rare. Your clothing wasn't a fashion statement. It was a survival mechanism. Changing clothes was a luxury for the rich. Nobles changed multiple times a day. Peasants didn't change at all. You wore the same tunic for weeks, possibly months, through storms, sickness, sleep, and sweat. In winter, that tunic got stiff from moisture, crusted with smoke, and layered with grime. Removing it meant freezing. Washing it meant losing precious body heat. So you didn't. And even if you wanted to wash your clothes, where would you do it? The river? It might be frozen solid. The bucket? That water was needed for drinking, not scrubbing. Layers were life. Winter meant piling every scrap you owned onto your body. Tunic over under tunic. Hose wrapped in leg bindings. Cloak fastened with bone or wooden pins. Animal skin over everything if you had it. Rags around hands, feet, neck. Underwear? Maybe a simple linen bry shorts or shift. But you didn't strip to it at night. You didn't hang it to air out. You just kept it on, always. You might stuff straw between layers. You might wrap your legs in strips of old fabric. You might borrow your dead uncle's cloak and sleep next to a goat. It wasn't about warmth. It was about survival. Shoes were optional and off-leather was expensive. Most peasants went barefoot in warmer months. In winter, they wore wooden clogs, painful, stuffed cloth boots soaked quickly, simple hide shoes bound with rope or leather. Thongs. Shoes were patched repeatedly. If the soles wore out, you lined them with straw. If they froze, you beat them with rocks to soften them. If you lost one, you made do with a rag. You didn't take them off at night unless you had a warm spot near the fire, and even then, you slept with them under your head to keep them from freezing solid. Washing clothes, forget it. Soap was rare. Water was freezing. Firewood was precious. So how did people clean their clothes? They didn't. Not often. Some might scrape off filth with a knife. Others would beat the garment against a rock during rare thaws. A full wash might happen once or twice a year, often before a festival or holy day. Instead, peasants relied on smoke. That's right, smoking garments over fire to kill lice, musk odor, and repel pests. It didn't work, but it was the best they had. The smell was unavoidable. Very peasant stank. So did their clothes. Sweat soaked into fabric and never left. Urine especially, from children, was absorbed and dried in layers. Blood from childbirth or wounds stayed until the next rainfall. Animal dung, dirt, soot, and cooking grease were permanent perfumes. But no one judged you. Everyone smelled. That was life. Only nobles had scented oils, fresh linens, or servants to boil water. Peasants had smoke, piss, and hope. Lice, fleas, and skin infections were standard. Not changing clothes had consequences. Lice nested in seams and underarms. Fleas bred in straw bedding and fed off your thighs. Boils and skin infections formed under tight bindings or soaked hose. Scabis, ringworm, and fungal infections thrived in the dark. Moist creases of unwashed bodies. Peasants didn't complain, they scratched. They bled. They got on with it. Sometimes they burned their clothes just to be rid of the bugs, and then they were left with nothing. Dressing was for warmth. Not identity. Your clothes didn't say who you were. They said how cold you were. Colors faded fast. Everything turned brown, gray, or soot black from the fire. If you had a red tunic, it dulled to rust within months. Green turned swamp. Black, not even an option dye, was expensive, and black dye even more so. In winter, everyone looked the same, hunched, layered, wrapped, tired. The only statement your clothes made was this: I'm still alive. Children grew into and out of clothes. Kids wore whatever fit, usually handed down, patched, or adapted. A child's tunic might have been stitched together from 2 or 3 older garments. Holes weren't fixed unless they exposed skin. Shoes didn't come in sizes. You just wore what could be tied to your feet. Many children went barefoot even. In winter, many developed frostbite, especially on their toes. Some lost fingers. Clothing was not a right. It was a privilege. Undressing was dangerous. Taking off all your clothes could kill you. You lost all your body heat instantly. Wet clothes froze fast. Taking them off meant exposure. Dressing cold, stiff garments was exhausting and painful. That's why peasants didn't undress to sleep. They slept in full garb, sometimes even with their outer cloak still fastened. Nakedness wasn't just taboo, it was deadly. Your clothes were your coffin or your armor in the medieval world. Clothing wasn't about expression, it was about endurance. Your tunic was your shield. Your cloak was your last line of defense against the night. You didn't strip down. You didn't get comfortable. You wrapped yourself tighter, pulled the lice-ridden hood over your ears, tucked your fingers under your belt, and hoped the wind didn't bite through the seams tonight. If it did, you had no backup. Your clothes never came off because once they did, you might not get them back on in time. If winter in the medieval world was hard, then late winter was when things got truly desperate. By February, the root cellar was empty. The grains were gone. The animals were dead or dying, and the ground still frozen solid. This wasn't just winter. This was starvation season. The medieval poor didn't always die in battle or from plague. More often, they died in bed quiet, slow, and hollowed out from hunger. This chapter explores what medieval peasants did to survive when food ran out, and how desperation changed everything they thought was edible. The Hunger Gap. Why late winter was the worst. Every year had a gap. The harvest had been months ago eaten, spoiled, or stolen. New crops wouldn't come until spring or summer. Meat was gone unless you could trap or kill. Milk only if your goat or cow had survived. Eggs only if your chickens hadn't frozen or been eaten first. January was lean. February was brutal. March was deadly. The Hunger Gap wasn't just a phrase. It was a season, and every peasant knew it was coming. What's for dinner? Literally anything when food was scarce. The menu wasn't creative, it was desperate. Peasants ate whatever was left, which usually meant turnips and onions, the last root vegetables to rot, dried beans or lentils, if they were lucky, bread, but not fresh, and often moldy or rock-hard porridge, made from barley, oats, or rye, thinned with water, maybe a drop of animal fat. But when even that was gone, they got creative. Tree bark and grass, not a myth. Chroniclers and historians recorded it. People ate bark, especially inner bark, scraped from young trees and boiled into a gummy, bitter soup. Other foods during starvation included grass and moss, ground and mixed with water or stale flour, nettles and dandelions, foraged, boiled, and chewed slowly. Boiled. Leather, belts, shoes, saddle straps scraped, soaked, stewed. Clay and dirt. Yes, some peasants literally ate soil. It led to sickness and often death. They knew it wasn't food, but the body demands something. Rats, cats, and pigeons. The protein of last resort in normal times. A rat in your home was a pest. In late winter, it was a meal. Rats and mice were trapped, skinned, roasted. Cats once pets or rodent control disappeared. Pigeons and crows were shot with slings or caught in nets. Bones were boiled until they cracked, just to extract every last drop of fat or marrow. And yes, peasants often boiled bones multiple times. The broth grew thinner with each use. They didn't care. It was still warm, still edible. Bread wasn't what you think. Peasants rarely ate white bread. That was for lords. Their bread was dense, coarse, made from rye, barley, or oats, baked once every couple of weeks, often mixed with straw, bark flour, or ground peas in the dead of winter. That bread became so hard it could break teeth. Peasants softened it in water or hot broth if they had it. Otherwise, they gnawed it slowly. Mold was scraped off with a knife. The rest was eaten. Famine cakes and hunger bread in extreme hunger years due to bad harvests or war. Peasants created emergency foods. Famine cakes made from lichen, ground roots, tree bark, and water, baked on hot stones. Hunger bread, flour mixed with sawdust, weeds, and clay to bulk it up. These weren't meals. They were survival rations. People who ate them often got sick. But the alternative? Nothing. Alcohol, empty calories, false warmth. When food was low, alcohol played to roles. Calories, weak ale and beer still had grain sugars. Enough to get you through a day. Numbness. The buzz helped you ignore the hunger. Even children drank low alcohol beer. Water was unsafe. Ale was boiled. And brewed it was safer, even if weak. But in starvation season, the temptation to drink too much was real. People passed out on floors. They froze to death in barns. All because they chased a warm stomach with an empty cup. Food theft and field poaching. When hunger set in, crime went up. Peasants stole from fields even unripe crops. They poached deer, rabbits, and birds illegally. They dug up buried food caches belonging to neighbors. Some even raided storehouses, monasteries, or the Lord's kitchen. Punishment? Brutal. Theft could earn you mutilation or death. Poaching from the Lord's lands meant hanging. But when your child was crying from hunger, punishment didn't matter. Survival did. Cannibalism was rare, but real historical records don't lie. During the worst famines, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, there are documented cases of parents eating dead children, bodies being stolen from graves, travelers being killed for meat. It wasn't common. It was taboo. But in the worst years, when even bark was gone, it happened. And people who did it, they didn't brag. They didn't write about it. They buried the truth as deep as they could. Fasting for God door because you had no choice. Church encouraged fasting as a spiritual act. No meat, no fat, no joy dot, but for peasants in winter. Every day was fasting. They couldn't afford meat even when it was allowed. So when Lent came 40+ days of limited food, they didn't notice. They were already starving. Some prayed harder. Others cursed the sky. Everyone felt it in their bones. Children were the first to suffer. Kids had smaller bodies, less fat. They needed food more often. They fainted in fields. They cried themselves to sleep. They stopped growing. Some simply didn't wake up. A child who made it through winter was already a fighter. A family who kept all their kids alive. A miracle. Spring meant life or more death. You'd think spring brought relief. But sometimes it brought more pain. Melting snow revealed corpses. Rats exploded in population and spread disease. Starving animals attacked humans. Crops failed again. People planted seeds with shaking hands, hoping they'd live long enough to eat what grew. Hunger wasn't a moment, it was a season. Starvation in the medieval world wasn't about a missed meal. It was a long, slow burn, a sickness of the stomach and soul. You ate whatever wouldn't kill you immediately, hoping it wouldn't kill you slowly. And when you reached into an empty grain sack, knowing there was nothing left, not in the cellar, not in the woods, not in your neighbor's barn, you faced the real test. Would you steal? Would you break? Would you give your last crust to your child? Or would you finally lay down, too tired to feel anything at all? That was starvation season. And it came every year when winter bit deep in medieval Europe. The body suffered and medicine didn't save you. It confused you, burned you, or killed. You fasted. There were no antibiotics, no doctors in the modern sense. If you got sick in winter, you had two options: hope or superstition. Most peasants had both, because once your throat closed, your fever spiked, or your lungs filled with fluid. There was no cavalry coming. Instead, there was wool soaked in animal fat. There was warm urine. There were charms, prayers, leeches, and a local wise woman who might be your healer or accused of causing your illness. In the first place, this is how peasants treated sickness in the freezing dark, with desperation, trial and error, and a little bit of magic. You didn't call a doctor. You called the woman down the lane. Medical knowledge in peasant villages didn't come from books. It came from word of mouth, passed down from grandmothers, mothers, and wives. The local healer might be an elderly woman with herbal knowledge, a midwife who also handled versa farmer, who knew how to set bones. They used what they had: plants, heat, animals, and belief. But if the sickness was too strange or lasted too long, they could just as easily be blamed for causing it. Wool, piss, and grease. The DIY healing kitlets break down the medicine cabinet of a peasant household. Wool, used as bandages or wrapped around aching joints for warmthering, believed to disinfect wounds and cleanse infection. Animal fat or tallow, rubbed on the chest for coughs or burned to create smoke for spiritual cleansing. Garlic and onions, used in tonics or poultices believed to draw out poison. Honey, rare but valuable, used to soothe sore throats. Boiled herbs, nettles, sage, yarrow, and mint for teas and compresses. Most cures were about reducing pain, not eliminating the cause. Fever, wrap in blankets and hope they sweat it out. Infection, drain it with a blade or a hot iron. Leeches and bleeding, when in doubt, drain them. If you lived near a monastery or had a traveling barber surgeon pass through, you might hear the worst advice: let's balance the humors. This meant bloodletting. Cut the arm, drain the blood, pray the fever breaks. Leeches were also used if they could be found, but poor peasants often resorted to knives and crude tools instead. Many died not from the disease, but from the cure. Burn the sickness out. Some peasants believed illness came from demons or bad air. So what did they do? Burned herbs to smoke out the evil, slept next to the fire to sweat out a fever, pressed hot irons against infected skin, drank heated alcohol to kill cold inside the bones. It didn't work, but it gave them a sense of control. And in winter, when control was slipping fast, that mattered. Magic and faith were medicine too. If the healer's remedies failed, people turned to prayer. Saints like Saint Sebastian for plague or Saint Apollonia for toothache were invoked. Charms and amulets hung over the bed or tied to the sick person's wrist. Witchcraft accusations. If someone got worse after treatment, the healer might be accused of casting a curse. Religion was deeply tangled with health, sin, demons. Curses, they weren't metaphors. People believed sickness could be punishment or dark magic. And if they believed it hard enough, sometimes that belief killed the healer before the fever killed the patient. There was no flu season. There was dying time every winter. Had a stretch where illness swept through like a grim wind. Fever-scaring fits, vomiting rations, collapse, and no one knew what caused it. Cold, evil spirits, rotten food, curses, God. They didn't understand disease. They just knew when one child coughed, the others would soon follow. And sometimes none of them would see spring. You survived through luck and firelight if you lived through a winter illness. It wasn't because the remedy worked. It was because you were strong enough. Someone kept the fire going. You had something to drink. You didn't bleed too much. The fever broke. There were no guarantees, no recovery plans. If you got better, it was a miracle. If not, you were wrapped in old cloth there and buried in frozen soil. Medicine wasn't science. It was scraps, and precious medieval peasants didn't have penicillin. They had boiled roots, fat-soaked wool, and the whispered hope that a fever would break before the firewood ran out. They fought death with garlic, piss, and whispered charms. They endured pain in silence, hoped in shadows, and prayed harder when the coughing didn't stop. This wasn't healthcare, it was survival. Medieval childhood wasn't an age of innocence. It was a gamble. If you were born into a peasant family in the Middle Ages, you had about a 50-50th chance of surviving past your 5th birthday, and winter made those odds even worse. The cold didn't care how young you were. In fact, it preferred the young, smaller bodies, weaker immune systems, no fat reserves. The tiniest chill could become a death sentence. And if your family didn't have enough food, fire, or faith, you were likely gone before the thought. This chapter lays bare the brutal truth of what winter meant for medieval peasant children, and what parents did to keep them alive. Birth in winter was a dangerous start-first mistake. Being born in the cold months, homes were freezing. Midwives had to work next to dying fires or in candlelight. No sterile tools, no heat lamps, no antibiotics. Blood froze, fingers went numb. Babies didn't cry loud, they wheezed. Many newborns were stillborn. Others were born too small, too cold, too weak. If a midwife didn't act fast or didn't make it in time, the child died. So did the mother, sometimes. In winter, life began on the edge of death. Infants slept in arms, not cradless, a crib in the corner. Luxury. Most peasant mothers slept with their infants tucked under their tunics, pressed against bare skin. Why? Body heat was the only warmth available. Blankets weren't safe for newborns. Hearths only heated a few feet out. But this came with risk. Mothers fell asleep exhausted. Infants suffocated, or rolled off, or got crushed between bodies in a shared bed. Still, it was better than letting the babies sleep alone and freeze before morning. Cold was constant, and unforgiving children were wrapped in whatever cloth straps the family had old. Cloaks, adult. Shirts, sacks turned into gowns. No socks. No gloves. No waterproof anything. Their skin cracked. Their fingers turned blue. Their lips peeled. And when their core body temperature dropped, there were no warm baths. No heaters, only their mother's arms, and a fire that might be down to its last log. Food was scarce, especially for the young children needed more calories, but got less. Babies were weaned early to save the mother's strength. Older kids ate gruel, onion broth, stale bread if anything. Starving families prioritized feeding the strongest. That meant infants. Toddlers and frail kids often came last. Not out of cruelty, out of survival logic. Malnutrition made them weak. Weakness made them sick. Sickness killed them. Illness spread fast and hit hard. Any child coughed within days. Half the household was down. Croup, pneumonia, dysentery, and fever hit kids first. No doctors, no understanding of contagion. Remedies were basic herbs, warm cloths, or prayer. If one child died, the others often followed. There were no quarantines, no antibiotics, and a parent could only do so much when for children were coughing and the fire was going out. They slept in the worst spots in a family bed. Kids were usually placed on the outside edges. Parents huddled in the middle to create heat. Infants were held, but toddlers, often left with just a rag and the wall. They absorbed the cold first. Many never made it to morning. superstition didn't help sometimes. It made things where separants turned to charms, herbs, and church blessings to protect their children. Amulets were tied to wrists. Crosses were painted in ash over doorways. Spells and chants were whispered when fevers hit. But if a child got sick anyway, blame often landed on a neighbor, or the midwife, or the mother herself. In worst cases, the mother was accused of cursing her own child through unholy thoughts. Grief wasn't always met with sympathy. There was no time to grieve. A child died. The family dug a shallow grave if the ground wasn't frozen solid. Sometimes the body was wrapped in cloth and stored in a shed or under snow until burial was possible. There were no headstones, no formal funerals, just another winter death. Then the chores resumed. Wood had to be chopped. Livestock had to be fed. Life didn't pause for pain. Parents mourned in silence and feared for the next child already coughing in the corner. Yet children did survive. Barely some children made it. They learned to stay near the fire. They drank whatever broth they were given. They wore their siblings' clothes, riddled with lice. They learned the cold young and stopped complaining. Survivors grew up fast. By age 6, they were tending animals, gathering kindling, and caring for younger siblings. By age 10, they were working full-time. Love didn't look like hugs. You might think peasant parents didn't love their children. They did. But love wasn't soft. Love was food when they had none. Love was risking punishment to steal firewood. Love was staying up all night to keep a fevered child warm with their own body heat. And sometimes love meant letting go quietly, quickly, and without falling apart. Because there were still more mouths to feed. Childhood was survival school in the medieval world. Children weren't coddled. They were forged. The cold didn't spare them. Hunger didn't skip them. Illness found them first. But some survived. And those who did, those who stood up after burying siblings, after chewing bark, after shivering through another night on the floor, became the backbone of the next generation. Not because they were stronger, but because they never had the luxury to be weak. Nightfall in medieval Europe didn't bring rest. It brought risk. When the last light vanished behind the trees and the wind howled through the thatched roof, you didn't exhale in peace. You listened for pause, for footsteps, for creaking wood that wasn't yours. Because out there past the glow of your dying fire, something might be coming. In the Middle Ages, the dark wasn't empty. It was crowded with hunger, predators, and desperate men. This chapter dives into the danger of the medieval night and how peasants defended themselves when even locked doors couldn't keep evil out. The village didn't sleep easy. There were no police, no gates, no walls in most rural villages. And even when there were, they didn't stop everything. Thieves could strike from neighboring towns. Bandits might descend from the woods. Wolves came looking for livestock or children. Revenge killings, debt disputes, or land feuds could boil over under cover of night. So peasants stayed alert, one eye open, one hand on the fire poker, because darkness was when laws stopped and survival instincts kicked in. No one patrolled except each other. Some villages appointed a night watcher, rotating duty, shared by local men. These weren't trained guards. They were farmers with clubs, millers with torches, old soldiers with aching knees and rusty knives. They took shifts walking through the village or standing outside homes. Sometimes they rang bells. Sometimes they just shouted warnings if they saw anything move. But often, the watch was just a father staying up late, staring at his crooked door, daring something to try it. Doors were barely barriers the average peasant home had. A wooden door, a simple bar, or latch gaps wide enough to see daylight through if someone really wanted in. They got in, quietly or with force. There were no deadbolts, no reinforcements. You might brace a stool under the handle or stack pots behind the door to make noise. But if bandits came in numbers, you weren't defending, you were praying. Wolves were a real and constant threat. Wolves weren't fantasy. They were reality, especially in harsh winters when prey was scarce. Packs attacked livestock pens. Lone wolves wandered into courtyards. Children were taken from fields or yards. There are even historical records of entire villages abandoning homes due to wolf attacks. Some families kept fires burning all night outside the barn. Others built raised platforms or crude enclosures. Some simply stayed up listening for growls. A wolf howl in the dark wasn't chilling. It was confirmation that you weren't sleeping tonight. Weapons. Whatever you could grab. Peasants didn't have swords. They had wooden staves, pitchforks, hatchets, and hammers, iron pokers from the hearth. Slingshots for kids, maybe a dagger passed down or stolen. But they weren't warriors. They were workers. If you had to fight at night, it was messy, desperate, and brutal. Fires were both shield and beacon fires scared off wolves. It also lit your doorway, but it made you a target. Some thieves used fire against their victims, lighting a barn to draw a family out, then robbing them while they tried to save it. Others waited for firelight to go out before creeping in. Either way, you had to choose visibility or stealth, heat or safety. There was no right answer. Some homes slept in shifts for defense. You talked about sleeping in shifts for warmth. But sometimes, someone stayed up just to guard. Older children were trained to watch the fire and the door. Mothers rocked babies and watched the walls. Fathers sat with weapons across their knees. No alarms, no clocks, just instinct. If the dog barked, if the wind changed, if the chickens got loud, you were on your feet, fast. Revenge attacks were personal and deadly in lawless areas. Grudges didn't fade. They waited for the dark. A land dispute turned into a midnight stabbing. A loan unpaid ended in torchlight and screams. A woman insulted was found dead in a ditch, and often no one was arrested. Justice wasn't guaranteed. The night protected both victim and killer. Superstition made the night worse. It wasn't just physical threats. Peasants feared spirits too. Ghosts of unburied souls, witches flying under the moon, demons slipping in through the chimney. Curses left at the doorstep. They nailed charms over the door, hung bones in rafters, burned herbs to cleanse the home. Did it work? Probably not. But belief gave people courage when the night pressed in and the wolves were quiet. You had to be ready to flee or fight. Many peasants had a plan, escape route, a back door, a hole in the wall, a loose board, emergency stash, a bundle of food, tools, or coins near the door, hide spot for children or valuables. If trouble came, you didn't hesitate. You ran or you fought and hoped the fire still burned when you got back. Night wasn't sleep. It was a second shift. When the sun went down, danger clocked in. Peasants didn't rest. They stood guard with clubs and pitchforks. They listened for footsteps. They whispered prayers while staring at the door, begging it to hold one more night. Wolves howled. Thieves waited. Revenge plotted. And still, someone kept watch, because not everyone who closed their eyes woke up again. That was night in the medieval world. And it never came empty. It might sound strange, even insane, but medieval peasants partied in the dead of winter. Not because they had time, not because they had plenty, but because they had to. When the cold was cruel and hunger howled, the people danced, drank, sang, and gathered around bonfires, not as a luxury, as resistance, as ritual, as the only spark of warmth and life in a world of frozen mud, empty fields, and long nights. This chapter explores how and why medieval peasants celebrated in winter and what those festivals meant when you had nothing left to give but your breath and your faith. Celebration wasn't optional. It was medicine. You didn't throw a festival in January because you had extra. You did it because you were afraid you wouldn't make it to spring. A festival distracted from death. A feast reminded you of hope. A song made you forget hunger. A ritual gave you control in a season ruled by chaos. For the medieval peasant, winter celebration wasn't about joy. It was about defiance. Yule, the original winter bash before Christmas, was Christian. It was Yule, a pagan midwinter feast that celebrated the solstice, the longest night of the year, the return of the sun's survival. Through darkness, bonfires were lit. Animals were slaughtered, especially pigs. Mead was poured. People danced around fire and decorated homes with evergreen symbols of life. That didn't die in winter. The church later absorbed Yule into Christmas, but the feasting, drinking, and candle burning remained. Yule wasn't about gifts. It was about outlasting the darkness. 12 days of Christmas. Not just a song. Christmas season lasted from December 25th to January 6th, and it was wild. Feasts, if you had anything left, games, and riddles, masked dances, and role reversal. Peasants acting like nobles, parades with animal masks, and sacred songs. Scandalite processions and midnight masses. For those 12 days, life bent. Rules relaxed. Joy was allowed, even demanded, because by then the cold had settled and people needed something to lift their spirits. Feasting wasn't gluttony, it was strategy. You may wonder, why feast when food was scarce? Here's why. Animals couldn't be fed through winter, so they were slaughtered in December. Better to eat them than let them starve. Meat doesn't keep. Without salt or snow storage, it spoiled fast. So you threw a feast. Shared food bonded communities. You gave. You received. You survived. For one night, the fire roared. The pot was full, and the ale flowed. Because tomorrow, Back to cold gruel and boiled bark. Candlemas, light in the depths of winter, celebrated on February 2nd. Candlemas marked the halfway point through winter. It honored the purification of merry Christian origin, the return of light pagan root. A symbolic restart. Churches blessed candles. Villagers walked with fire in hand. In the coldest, bleakest part of winter, Candlemas whispered, "You're almost there." It was more than a holiday. It was emotional fuel. Mumming, masking, and mayhem. Medieval festivals didn't look like modern ones. They were chaotic, loud, and full of strange rituals. Mummers dressed in rags, straw, or animal skins. Masked dancers represented death, fertility, demons, or seasons. Feast of Fools Days turned the social order upside down. Servants gave orders, peasants mocked lords. Public competitions like wrestling or riddles burned energy and spirits. It was messy, sometimes dangerous, but for peasants, it was the only real thrill of the year. Alcohol was ritual and relief. Ale, cider, mead. These weren't just for fun. They were safer than water, warming in a literal and emotional sense, mood altering, briefly lifting the weight of hunger and grief. Children drank weak ale. Adults drank stronger brews. And when festival time came, they drank deep. Because in the morning, the cold would return. But for one night, everything was liquid warmth. Church and celebration, a tense partnership. Church both blessed and regulated winter festivals, encouraged prayer, purity, and symbolic fasting, condemned lewd games, drunkenness, or pagan rituals, tried to frame celebration as spiritual, not carnal. But the people, starving, shivering, weren't interested in theology. They were interested in surviving. So yes, they sang hymns, but they also danced with horns on, lit fires too big, drank too much, laughed too loud. Because God might forgive, but winter wouldn't. Children got to be children for one night during festivals. Kids sang carols door to door in exchange for food, played stick games in the snow, ate roasted nuts, meat scraps, or warm bread, watched performances with wide eyes. The rest of the year, they were laborers, but on these nights, they were just alive, and that was enough. Laughter as resistancia, joke in the dark, was a weapon. A dance in the cold was rebellion. Every laugh was a middle finger to death. So peasants didn't just endure winter, they mocked it. They feasted when they had nothing. They danced in frost. They lit candles against a world that wanted them gone. And somehow, that laughter carried them through. Festival wasn't frivolous. It was fire. In the darkest, hungriest season of the year, medieval peasants did the one thing winter didn't expect. They celebrated loudly, desperately, together. They burned light in defiance, shared food when there was none to spare, danced on frozen ground, prayed, laughed, drank, and dared to smile in the face of the season that tried to kill them. That wasn't weakness. That was power. In the depths of a medieval winter, peasants didn't just rely on firewood, wool, and luck. They relied on something else, something invisible, something they couldn't touch but clung to like the edge of a cliff. Faith. When crops failed, when children died, when the cold bit into their bones, they turned to the church not just for salvation, but for answers, for heat of the soul, for an explanation for all the misery that surrounded them. This chapter reveals how the church shaped every moment of winter, how religion was used to explain suffering, organize survival, and sometimes, sadly, justify inaction. The church controlled the calendar, and the for everything revolved around the liturgical calendar. Not just holidays, but seasons of fasting, feasting, and prayer. In winter, Advent prepared you for Christ's birth spiritually, not materially. Christmas was both holy and practical, a chance to feast and distract from hunger. Lent often began while winter still gripped the land, demanding even more fasting at the worst possible time. The church said, "Suffer with Christ." But the peasant family was already suffering cold, tired, and hungry. Still, they obeyed. Because disobedience wasn't just rebellion, it was sin. Suffering was framed as holy were people freezing. Because of original sin. Because God was testing them. Because the world was fallen and broken. The cold, the disease, the famine, they weren't just natural. They were divine punishment, or part of God's greater plan. This didn't always bring comfort, but it gave a reason. And in a world where peasants had almost no control, a reason was powerful. Churches weren't warm, but they were hopeful. Most village churches were stone buildings with no heating, echo chambers for breath and prayer. So cold, your hands froze on the pew. And yet, people came. In droves. They sat in silence, sang through cracked lips, lit candles that barely cut the darkness. Why? Because in that frozen building, they heard that they mattered to something bigger. That this pain meant something, that there was an afterlife, where none of this existed. That idea kept a lot of people going through very long, very cold nights. Priests as lifelines and gatekeepers. Village priest was more than a religious figure. He was the only literate person most peasants knew, a link to the outside world and church power. The one who baptized, married, and buried everyone. He reminded you to confess your sins, pay your tithes, and stay in God's grace. But he also blessed your sick child, lit your candle during a blizzard, calmed your fear when death felt close. Priests could be kind. They could also be corrupt. Either way, they held power over your soul, which mattered when you thought death was near. Holy relics and superstitions in winter when prayer wasn't enough. Peasants turned to objects, relics, bones of saints, cloth from miracles, amulets, crosses, medals, carved symbols, blessed candles, lit in storms to ward off death. Saints' names, whispered in the dark when fevers spiked. These weren't just tokens. They were tools for survival, spiritual armor against a world that offered no guarantees. Witch hunts and winter panic when things got really bad, when livestock died, when children froze, when crops failed even before spring. Blame had to fall somewhere. And it often fell on women. The church preached against witchcraft. Superstition did the rest. So, a healer whose herbs didn't work. Suspect. A woman with strange eyes who lived alone. Witch. A midwife whose babies died. Cursed. Some were dragged before priests. Others were beaten or cast out. In desperate winters, fear outweighed logic. Faith was supposed to protect, but sometimes it pointed the torch. Monasteries, rare islands of help if you were lucky enough to live near a monastery. You had a slight edge. Monks stored food. Monasteries had better medical knowledge. They handed out bread, soup, and occasionally shelter. They copied texts that contained healing knowledge and survival practices. But even monasteries had limits, and sometimes they closed their gates. Still, for many, the church bell in the distance was a sign that someone had a fire still burning. The church told you, "Endure now, rejoice lateth" message was simple and brutal. This life is suffering. The next one isn't. If you shivered now, you would rest in heaven. If you buried your child now, you would be reunited later. If you went hungry, you would feast beside Christ someday. That promise kept peasants moving forward, even when forward meant more snow, more loss, and more silent nights. Faith gave structure to the cows without the church. Winter was just cold and death with it. Winter became a spiritual journey, a time to repent, to fast, to prepare for the return of the sun. And the sun. Peasants didn't understand climate. They didn't understand medicine. But they understood faith. It gave meaning to misery. And that meaning was often the only thing between survival and despair. The church wasn't just a place. It was a flame in the harshest months of the year. The church gave peasants a story bigger than themselves, a reason to endure, a promise of warmth after the cold, and a community bound not just by fire, but by belief. Faith didn't cure the cold. It didn't feed the hungry, but it made sense of the suffering. And sometimes, that was the most powerful survival tool of all. Medieval peasants didn't live free. They lived under the cold, under the church, and most of all under the lord of the manor. Your land wasn't yours. Your crops weren't entirely yours. Even the firewood you burned might not be legally yours. And yet, your survival often depended on the very man who could take it all away. In the deep freeze of winter, your relationship with the local noble was more than feudal, it was life than death. This chapter digs into the double-edged role of the medieval lord, how he controlled your resources, how he protected or neglected your village, and how your very survival hung on the whims of someone who probably had a fur-lined cloak and a full pantry. You didn't own the land you worked, a peasant. You were likely a serf bound to the land. You couldn't leave without permission. You farmed your own plot, but you also owed labor and taxes to the lord. In winter, you still owed rent even if your crops failed. You still owed grain or food even if you were hungry. You still had to repair his buildings even if your roof leaked. You couldn't argue. You couldn't withhold payment. You couldn't appeal, because the lord wasn't just a landlord. He was the law. Taxes didn't pause for snow. The lord's men came collecting year-round. A portion of your grain went to the manor. So did your livestock if you couldn't pay in coin. And in some cases, so did your labor. You were summoned to shovel snow, chop wood, or dig trenches. Even while your own family froze, failure to pay could mean confiscation of your tools, animals, or food. Fines, yes, even more money. Violence, a beating, prison, or eviction into the snow. Winter didn't stop the tax. It just made it hurt more. The forest was his, not yours. need firewood, want to hunt a rabbit, hope to collect berries, sticks, or a fallen branch, to bad. The Lord owned the forest, and taking anything without permission was poaching a serious crime. Peasants caught with firewood could be fined, whipped, or worse. Hunting deer was considered theft from the crown in some places, so peasants snuck out at night, gathered in secret, and risked punishment just to keep the fire going. Winter made everyone a criminal. But lords weren't always monsters. Not every noble was a tyrant. In fact, many understood a simple truth: dead peasants don't farm. Some lords helped their villages survive, distributed grain from storage during famines, excused taxes temporarily after a blizzard or storm, let peasants gather dead wood or hunt rabbits in extreme cold. Built grain mills or ovens to help the entire community. These lords weren't saints. They were smart. Keeping your people alive meant keeping your estate alive. And word spread fast. A cruel lord got rebellion. A fair one got loyalty. The manor house was warm but distant while you huddled by a dying fire. The manor house had a fireplace in every room, wool blankets. Servants. Food stores, and a winter larder. But you didn't see it. Peasants rarely entered the manor. They saw the guards, the taxes, the messengers, but not the warmth. To you, the manor might as well have been a castle on the moon. And during winter, it became a symbol, a place that had what you needed, but wouldn't share it freely. Obligations went both ways. In theory, feudal law wasn't just about what the peasant owed. It was also about what the lord owed the people: protection from raiders or bandits, justice in local disputes, emergency aid during famine, or disaster bid if your lord was lazy, cruel, or away fighting in some far-off war. Those obligations vanished, and you were left in the snow, figuring things out on your own. Discontent grew in cold soil. Winter brought more than frost. It brought resentment. When taxes came due and your child was starving. When a guard beat your neighbor for collecting wood. When the grain stores were locked while your wife coughed blood. Anger simmered, quietly, carefully. But it simmered. Rebellions were rare but not impossible. And many started in years with hard winters. Justice was the Lord's, but not always fair. If someone stole food from a neighbor, if someone killed a goat for meat, the case went to the Lord's court. If there was one, he could decide coal and fines. Flogging. Public humiliation. Or nothing at all. You didn't always get a trial. Sometimes justice was a lord's mood. Winter loyalty could be bought, or lost. Peasants remembered who helped. If the lord shared firewood, you remembered. If he ignored your cries for food, you remembered that. If his guards harassed you all season, that story spread for generations. The line between ruler and tyrant got very thin when the snow piled up. And yet, you stayed. We didn't. Peasants run because they couldn't. Legally, physically, economically, you couldn't survive alone in the forest. Other manors wouldn't take you. The church condemned it. Even more fasting at the worst possible time. The church said, suffer with Christ. But the peasant family was already suffering cold, tired, and hungry. Still, they obeyed. Because disobedience wasn't just rebellion, it was sin. Suffering was framed as holy were people freezing. because of original sin, because God was testing them, because the world was fallen and broken. The cold, the disease, the famine, they weren't just natural. They were divine punishment, or part of God's greater plan. This didn't always bring comfort, but it gave a reason. And in a world where peasants had almost no control, a reason was powerful. Churches weren't warm, but they were hopeful. Most village churches were stone buildings with no heating, echo chambers for breath and prayer. So cold, your hands froze on the pew. And yet, people came in droves. They sat in silence, sang through cracked lips, lit candles that barely cut the darkness. Why? Because in that frozen building, they heard that they mattered to something bigger, that this pain meant something, that there was an afterlife where none of this existed. That idea kept a lot of people going through very long, very cold nights. Priests as lifelines and gatekeepers. Village priest was more than a religious figure. He was the only literate person most peasants knew, a link to the outside world and church power, the one who baptized, married, and buried everyone. He reminded you to confess your sins, pay your tithes, and stay in God's grace. But he also blessed your sick child, lit your candle during a blizzard, calmed your fear when death felt close. Priests could be kind. They could also be corrupt. Either way, they held power over your soul, which mattered when you thought death was near. Holy relics and superstitions in winter when prayer wasn't enough. Peasants turned to objects, relics, bones of saints, cloth from miracles, amulets, crosses, medals, carved symbols, blessed candles, lit in storms to ward off death. Saints' names, whispered in the dark when fevers spiked. These weren't just tokens. They were tools for survival, spiritual armor against a world that offered no guarantees. Witch hunts and winter panic when things got really bad, when livestock died, when children froze, when crops failed even before spring. Blame had to fall somewhere, and it often fell on women. The church preached against witchcraft. Superstition did the rest. So, a healer whose herbs didn't work. Suspect. A woman with strange eyes who lived alone. Witch. A midwife whose babies died. Cursed. Some were dragged before priests. Others were beaten or cast out. In desperate winters, fear outweighed logic. Faith was supposed to protect, but sometimes it pointed the torch. Monasteries, rare islands of help if you were lucky enough to live near a monastery. You had a slight edge. Monks stored food. Monasteries had better medical knowledge. They handed out bread, soup, and occasionally shelter. They copied texts that contained healing knowledge and survival practices. But even monasteries had limits, and sometimes they closed their gates. Still, for many, the church bell in the distance was a sign that someone had a fire still burning. The church told you, endure now, rejoice. Lateth message was simple and brutal. This life is suffering. The next one isn't. If you shivered now, you would rest in heaven. If you buried your child now, you would be reunited later. If you went hungry, you would feast beside Christ someday. That promise kept peasants moving forward, even when forward meant more snow, more loss, and more silent nights. Faith gave structure to the cows. Without the church, winter was just cold and death with it. Winter became a spiritual journey, a time to repent, to fast, to prepare for the return of the sun. And the sun. Peasants didn't understand climate. They didn't understand medicine. But they understood faith. It gave meaning to misery, and that meaning was often the only thing between survival and despair. The church wasn't just a place. It was a flame in the harshest months of the year. The church gave peasants a story bigger than themselves, a reason to endure, a promise of warmth after the cold, and a community bound not just by fire, but by belief. Faith didn't cure the cold. It didn't feed the hungry, but it made sense of the suffering. And sometimes, that was the most powerful survival tool of all. Medieval peasants didn't live free. They lived under the cold, under the church, and most of all under the lord of the manor. Your land wasn't yours. Your crops weren't entirely yours. Even the firewood you burned might not be legally yours. And yet, your survival often depended on the very man who could take it all away. In the deep freeze of winter, your relationship with the local noble was more than feudal. It was life and death. This chapter digs into the double-edged role of the medieval lord, how he controlled your resources, how he protected or neglected your village, and how your very survival hung on the whims of someone who probably had a fur-lined cloak and a full pantry. You didn't own the land you worked. I toss a peasant. You were likely a serf bound to the land. You couldn't leave without permission. You farmed your own plot, but you also owed labor and taxes to the lord. In winter, you still owed rent even if your crops failed. You still owed grain or food even if you were hungry. You still had to repair his buildings even if your roof leaked. You couldn't argue. You couldn't withhold payment. You couldn't appeal, because the lord wasn't just a landlord. He was the law. Taxes didn't pause for snow. The lord's men came collecting year-round. A portion of your grain went to the manor. So did your livestock if you couldn't pay in coin. And in some cases, so did your labor. You were summoned to shovel snow, chop wood, or dig trenches. Even while your own family froze, failure to pay could mean confiscation of your tools, animals, or food. Fines, yes, even more money. Violence, a beating, prison, or eviction into the snow. Winter didn't stop the tax. It just made it hurt more. The forest was his, not yours. Need firewood. Want to hunt a rabbit. Hope to collect berries, sticks, or a fallen branch. To bad. The lord owned the forest, and taking anything without permission was poaching, a serious crime. Peasants caught with firewood could be fined, whipped, or worse. Hunting deer was considered theft from the crown in some places. So peasants snuck out at night, gathered in secret, and risked punishment just to keep the fire going. Winter made everyone a criminal. But lords weren't always monsters. Not every noble was a tyrant. In fact, many understood a simple truth. Dead peasants don't farm. Some lords helped their villages survive, distributed grain from storage during famines, excused taxes temporarily after a blizzard or storm, let peasants gather dead wood or hunt rabbits in extreme cold. Built grain mills or ovens to help the entire community. These lords weren't saints. They were smart, Keeping your people alive meant keeping your estate alive. And word spread fast. A cruel lord got rebellion. A fair one got loyalty. The manor house was warm but distant while you huddled by a dying fire. The manor house had a fireplace in every room, wool blankets. Servants. Food stores, and a winter larder. But you didn't see it. Peasants rarely entered the manor. They saw the guards, the taxes, the messengers, but not the warmth. To you, the manor might as well have been a castle on the moon. And during winter, it became a symbol, a place that had what you needed, but wouldn't share it freely. Obligations went both ways. In theory, feudal law wasn't just about what the peasant owed. It was also about what the lord owed the people. Protection from raiders or bandits, justice in local disputes, emergency aid during famine, or disaster bid if your lord was lazy, cruel, or away fighting in some far-off war. Those obligations vanished, and you were left in the snow, figuring things out on your own. Discontent grew in cold soil. Winter brought more than frost. It brought resentment. When taxes came due and your child was starving. When a guard beat your neighbor for collecting wood. When the grain stores were locked while your wife coughed blood. Anger simmered quietly, carefully. But it simmered. Rebellions were rare but not impossible. And many started in years with hard winters. Justice was the Lord's, but not always fair. If someone stole food from a neighbor, if someone killed a goat for meat, the case went to the Lord's court. If there was one, he could decide fines. Flogging. Public humiliation. Or nothing at all. You didn't always get a trial. Sometimes justice was a lord's mood. Winter loyalty could be bought or lost. Peasants remembered who helped. If the lord shared firewood, you remembered. If he ignored your cries for food, you remembered that. If his guards harassed you all season, that story spread for generations. The line between ruler and tyrant got very thin when the snow piled up. And yet, you stayed. We didn't. Peasants run because they couldn't. Legally, physically, economically, you couldn't survive alone in the forest. Other manors wouldn't take you. The church condemned it. Some lashed out at their families, the priest, themselves. No one had a word for it, but they saw it. They called it the winter grief or the shadow. And it killed slowly. How peasants tried to prevent disease they didn't understand. Germs. But they understood patterns. So they tried to stay safe. Burnt herbs like sage and wormwood in the house. Covered mouths with cloth near the sick. Boiled water when possible. Avoided neighbors who looked off. Said daily prayers and lit candles for protection. Sometimes it worked. Mostly, it didn't. But belief was a medicine of its own. Death left its mark on the living given if you survived. You were never the same. Scars from frostbite. A wheeze in your lungs forever. Missing fingers. Memories of screams in the night. And winter didn't apologize. It just kept going. Winter didn't just freeze. It infected. In the medieval world, the cold wasn't quiet. It was coughing, screaming, shivering. It was fevers under lice-filled blankets, swollen glands, and shallow breaths. And for peasants, the worst part wasn't that sickness came. It was that no one could stop it. Spring didn't arrive with birdsong and flowers. Not for peasants. It arrived slowly. One melt. One muddy path. one drip of water off a collapsing roof. And with it came something sacred, survival. Because if you made it to spring, it meant one thing. You won. You beat the cold, the hunger, the illness, and the silence. You clawed your way through the longest nights on Earth and lived. This final chapter explores what the end of winter really meant to a medieval peasant. What changed? What came back to life? And how that brutal season shaped everything that followed. The first signs were subtle but wholly. Before spring flowers, before warm breezes, there were tiny signs. Soil softened, snow turned to slush. Birds returned, first a few, then more. Streams started moving again. Peasants noticed every change. A single green sprout felt like a miracle. A thawed field meant everything, because it meant work could begin again. And hope didn't feel insane. Survivors counted the missing. You didn't celebrate right away. First, you counted who didn't make it, which child had coughed her last, which neighbor's roof fell in, which family had to bury their mother with their bare hands. Survival came with guilt, but also with pride. You were scarred, starving, and sick, but still standing. That counted for something. Food didn't appear, it had to be ground. Spring didn't mean abundance. It meant planting. The fields were mud. Tools were damaged from months of cold. Oxen were weak. People were weaker. And yet they pushed forward. Seeds were planted with shaking hands. Patches of soil were cleared before the sun even rose. Everyone worked, kids, elders, everyone. Because if planting failed, next winter would be worse. The end of winter meant more work. There was no rest. You didn't enjoy spring. You rebuilt. Homes patched and rethatched. Firewood stores replenished. Barns repaired. Tools reforged. Your whole life was recovery. You didn't say, "Thank God that's over." You said, "Let's make sure we survive the next one." Traditions returned but felt different. Festivals like May Day, Easter, spring markets, they came back, but they were tinged with memory. Last May, your wife was alive. Last Easter, your neighbor gave you bread. Last year, your child danced. Now they were gone. Joy was quieter after winter, but it was still there, because feeling anything again meant you still had a heart beating. Relationships were redrawn. You knew who helped you. You knew who didn't. That neighbor who gave you firewood, trusted for life. The one who slammed the door, never forgiven. That stranger who shared soup with your children, family now. Hard winters didn't just kill people. They revealed them. The sick recovered, some of them. Not everyone who got sick died, but not everyone who lived got better. Some had permanent lung damage. Some limped. Some had frostbite scars that never healed. Some stopped speaking. Some were different, quiet, withdrawn, changed. Winter didn't leave everyone. It lived in some of them forever. Superstition shifted. Faith deepened after surviving. Peasants prayed harder, feared less, or in some cases, feared more. Some believed God had spared them. Others believed they'd survived despite him. Some started new rituals. Others abandoned old ones. But no one walked out of winter unchanged in belief. Children grew up overnight. If you were a child and made it to spring, you were tougher. You had seen death. You understood hunger. You were already working the fields, sowing, collecting water. There was no such thing as childhood anymore. There was only survival training for next year. The memory of winter stayed in the bone 7 months later. In the heat of summer, peasants talked about the bad freeze, looked at the sky like it could turn on them any second, stockpiled food, repaired every inch of their home. Winter might have ended, but the fear of it never did. It followed them into every season, and still, they laughed against all odds. They laughed again over a full bowl of stew. Around the first bonfire of the year. At a baby's cry, strong and healthy. At an old man's story about the worst winter of my life. Because joy was no longer light-hearted. It was earned. Survival was a badge and a curse. Surviving winter in the medieval world wasn't just about beating nature. It was about beating despair, disease, hunger, and time itself. It shaped your mind, your village, your future. It made you older, harder, and wiser. Because once you knew what it felt like to bury a child in the snow, once you knew the sound of a roof giving out in the dark, once you knew what it meant to cook bark for soup, you never forgot. But you also never feared the cold the same way again. Because now you knew you could survive it. Sleeping with animals was strategies. It sounds filthy, and it was, but it also saved lives. Bringing livestock inside during winter wasn't just practical. It was essential. Body heat. A single pig could warm a room. Chickens gave off heat, too. Even dogs. Security. Livestock were your life savings. If they froze, you starved. If they got stolen, you were ruined. Insulation. More bodies meant less empty, cold air. Peasants often let animals roam freely indoors at night. Chickens nested in rafters, dogs curled by the fire, goats butted up against the bed, pigs sometimes under the bed. Yes, it stank, but so did dying of cold. The family bed was a furnace of flesh and bed. One room, one heap of people, parents, children, sometimes grandparents. Everyone slept together, stacked like firewood. It wasn't cozy, it was a strategy. The outside sleepers, usually older kids or adults, took the cold. The middle sleepers, youngest and most vulnerable, were kept warm. The baby might be swaddled and held all night by the mother, sharing direct heat. You didn't roll over casually. Movement caused drafts. If someone got up to relieve themselves, it disrupted the entire bed's temperature. You endured the stink, the snoring, the squirming, because separating meant freezing. Fire wasn't a bedtime option. It's easy to imagine a roaring fire by the bedside. That's a myth. Fires ate wood, a resource peasants barely had. Smoke-filled homes' chimneys were rare. Ash and sparks caused burns, and whole homes burned down frequently. Instead, the fire was banked or smothered in ash at night to preserve coals until morning. The heat didn't reach the bed. If you slept far from the hearth, you felt it in your bones. Some families slept next to the hearth, even on the cold stone or dirt floor, just to get a few degrees of warmth. Heating stones. Not space we're talking survival hacks here, peasants. Sometimes heated flat stones or bricks in the fire. then wrapped them in cloth or moss and placed them in the bed. Primitive hot water bottles. The heat didn't last long, but it helped with the initial freeze of lying down. Water-filled bladders from animals were used too. Gross? Yes. Effective? Also yes. Day clothes became night watching into pajamas. Not a thing. The clothes you wore during the day stayed on at night. That included belts, boots, head coverings, and sometimes tools. Layers weren't stripped, they were added. Some peasants even slept with their tools, knives, hatchets, or sticks to fend off animals or thieves. Others kept a pouch of food under their tunic, so rats didn't steal it. You didn't undress for bed. You braced yourself for it. Night wasn't for sleeping, it was for surviving. A medieval winter night could last 14 to 16 hours. You didn't sleep straight through. You woke often to stoke the fire, turn over, shake off the chill, or relieve yourself. In a cold corner or clay pot, you lay awake listening wind, wolves, crying children, your own heartbeat. You prayed you'd wake up at all. Sometimes you didn't. The poor died differently than the rich. Nobles had feather beds, fur blankets, fireplaces, and multiple servants. Peasants had straw, livestock, and each other. And the death toll reflected that. Babies froze in their sleep. Elderly never woke up. Entire families died of carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly vented fires. No warm socks. No backup plan. If the night was cold enough, and it often was, you just hoped you weren't the one it chose. And yet, they survived passed down tricks. They helped each other. They shared beds and walls and food. Some built lean-tos around their homes to block wind. Others buried food and fuel under animal waste to keep it warm. Seriously, every family had a system. Every village had a rhythm. They didn't live through the coldest nights. They outlasted them, not because they were comfortable, because they refused to quit. Your blanket is a privilege if you're reading this wrapped in a clean comforter in a heated room. Wearing socks you bought at a store, remember this. A medieval peasant would have called that luxury. They fought the cold with mud, moss, straw, and muscle. They wrapped babies in rags and snuggled up to pigs for warmth. And if the cold didn't kill them, the filth might. But they still made it to morning again and again. Because in the end, survival wasn't about warmth. It was about for if the medieval peasant's home had a heart. It was the hearth. Not because it was cozy, not because it brought people together for a cheerful meal, but because without it, everyone in the house might die. The hearth wasn't a luxury. It was life support. It dried your clothes, cooked your food, sterilized your tools, warmed your body, lit your nights, boiled your water, and drove away death one coal at a time. But make no mistake, the hearth was also dangerous. One mistake and your home could go up in flames. Or you could slowly choke to death in your sleep. This was the medieval fireplace, not the one in storybooks. This was the real furnace that burned day and night, even when it barely had anything left to burn. There was no central heating, just the fire pit in most peasant homes. The hearth was nothing more than a pit, dug into the dirt floor or a crude stone platform in the center of the one-room house. It was surrounded by ash, soot, and singe marks. No chimney, normal. No ventilation, also normal. No separation from children or livestock, absolutely normal. The smoke had to rise and find its own way out through cracks, thatch, or a hole in the roof, and a lot of it didn't. That's why medieval ceilings were black, and people coughed constantly. Still, you needed the fire. No fire, no survival. It was never just for cooking, yes. Food was made here, but that wasn't its main job. The hearth had to warm the home in effectively dry, wet cloth, smoke meat, or fish for preservation, boil water for washing or medicining it, stones or irons for makeshift bed warmer, sterilize crude tools, or cloths, burn herbs, or dung to ward off evil and sickness. Superstition based, it was your medicine cabinet, your oven, your nightlight, your furnace, your protection from frost. That tiny circle of flame did everything. Keeping it burning was a full-time job. You didn't just light a fire and forget it. You tended it hourly, especially in winter. Wake up, stoke the fire, eat dinner, feed the fire, go into bed, bank the fire, cover it with ash to keep embers hot overnight. Mid-sleep, wake up coughing and relight the damn thing again. There were no matches. Fire starting was work. Flint, steel, kindling, and if your wood was damp, forget it. You might spend hours just trying to spark a flame. That's why people guarded embers like treasure. Wood was wealth. A poor peasant didn't have a stack of logs out back. Wood was hard to come by, especially in regions where nobles owned the forests. You couldn't just chop a tree. Doing so without permission could get you fined, beaten, or worse. So what did you burn? Twigs and branches scavenged from roadsides. Dry dung, yes. Poop from cows and horses. Peat moss. If you lived in northern regions, straw, grass, or thatch in emergencies. Old shoes, broken tools, animal bones, anything that caught fire. This meant smoke. A lot of it, thick, black, toxic. And you breathed it in daily. Fire could and did kill you, a blessing and a curse. Houses burned down regularly. A gust of wind, a knocked pot, a dropped ember gone. Children fell in and burned. Elders fainted near the fire and caught their clothes. Smoke. Inhalation kills silently in the night. Thatched roofs ignited easily, especially in dry winters. One careless moment could destroy a family, and there were no fire brigades. No buckets lined in a row, just neighbors screaming, trying to beat flames with rags. Lighting fires was a community's skill. You didn't survive winter alone. Sometimes you couldn't even light a fire alone. If your hearth went cold and your kindling was wet, you might go to a neighbor's house to borrow embers. People shared fire like they shared bread. It was part of the unspoken survival pact. In villages, women might cook multiple meals at one large hearth and deliver food to homes. In monasteries, community hearths kept flames going 24/7 for the entire village to access. Fire was life, and life was shared. The hearth was a spiritual center to a medieval belief. The hearth wasn't just a heat source, it was sacred. Offerings were sometimes tossed into the fire for protection. Ashes were used in blessings and rituals. Some believed fire spirits or saints protected homes from within the flame. This wasn't superstition for fun. It was psychological armor against the cold. People needed to believe the hearth could protect them, not just physically but spiritually too. It marked time and memory. Everything important happened around the hearth. Birthsteith's mellolistes measured time in how often you had to feed the fire. You remembered people by where they sat near it. You fell in love across it. You mourned beside it. It wasn't just a corner of the house. It was the house. Children grew up with fire and fear. Kids were taught early. Fire gives and fire takes. They learned to tend the hearth as soon as they could walk. They knew not to waste kindling, not to fall asleep too far from it, not to ever let it die out without warning. It was terrifying and magical, alive, breathing, demanding dot, and in homes that had nothing else, not wealth, not privacy, not peace. It was the one thing that felt powerful. Fire was the only thing between you and the cold in the medieval world. You didn't use fire, you depended on it dot. And if you lived in a peasant's hut, that meant one tiny hearth, one pile of damp sticks, one precious ember, and your entire family huddled around it, praying it would last until dawn. There was no backup, no furnace kicking in, no electric blanket, no try again tomorrow. If the fire failed, you might not wake up, and every night you knew it. When night fell over a medieval village, sleep didn't come easy. The memory of winter stayed in the bone 7 months later. In the heat of summer, peasants talked about the bad freeze, looked at the sky like it could turn on them any second, stockpiled food, repaired every inch of their home. Winter might have ended, but the fear of it never did. It followed them into every season, and still, they laughed against all odds. They laughed again over a full bowl of stew dot around the first bonfire of the year dot at a baby's cry. Strong and healthy dot at an old man's story about the worst winter of my life. Because joy was no longer light-hearted dot, it was earned. Survival was a badge and a curse-serving winter in the medieval world. Wasn't just about beating nature. It was about beating despair, disease, hunger, and time itself. It shaped your mind, your village, your future. It made you older, harder, and wiser. Because once you knew what it felt like to bury a child in the snow, once you knew the sound of a roof giving out in the dark, once you knew what it meant to cook bark for soup, you never forgot. But you also never feared the cold the same way again, because now you knew you could survive it.